The richest families in New York believed Ethan Moretti had finally made the biggest mistake of his life. But none of them knew the truth. The quiet girl standing at the end of the aisle was carrying a powerful secret. It was a secret powerful enough to change the Moretti empire forever. The crystal chandeliers above the cathedral scattered warm light across polished marble. Whispers drifted through the pews like invisible smoke. Every guest had arrived expecting to witness another victory for the spoiled heir of the Moretti family. He was the young Mafia boss who treated every privilege as if the world existed to satisfy him. Instead, they found themselves staring at the bride. Grace Harper stood alone beneath a veil that seemed almost too simple for a wedding that had cost millions. Her dress was elegant without trying to impress anyone. Her hands folded tightly in front of her bouquet. It was as though she hoped to disappear before anyone noticed her. The silence around her never lasted long. People whispered that she was the uncle's charity case. They said, "Poor Ethan, she isn't even beautiful, and this marriage won't survive a month." Grace heard every word, yet her eyes never lifted from the white roses in her hands. Years of being overlooked had taught her a valuable lesson. People often grew tired of cruelty when they received no reaction. Across the room, Ethan Moretti adjusted the cuff of his black suit with effortless confidence. Everything about him reflected quiet authority. His tailored jacket fit perfectly. His expensive watch caught the light without demanding attention. Even surrounded by governors, executives, judges, and old family allies, the room naturally shifted around him. Conversations paused whenever he moved. Men twice his age subtly stepped aside. He acknowledged no one. His cold gray eyes rested on the woman waiting beside the minister. Irritation settled across his expression. He told his attorney calmly that his uncle actually expected him to believe this was the best match for the Moretti name. The attorney answered carefully. He reminded Ethan that his uncle expected him to honor his late grandfather's agreement. Ethan gave the faintest smile, but it never reached his eyes. He said, "Agreements can be rewritten." The attorney replied, "Not this one." Before Ethan could respond, the minister invited the couple forward. Cameras flashed. Every powerful guest leaned forward, waiting for the inevitable humiliation. Grace slowly walked toward him. She kept her shoulders straight despite the weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes. When she finally stood beside Ethan, she whispered so softly only he could hear. She said, "I know this isn't what you wanted. I will never ask for anything beyond what this promise requires." Her voice surprised him. It carried neither bitterness nor fear. It only held quiet acceptance. Ethan studied her for the first time instead of merely looking at her. Behind these oversized glasses and carefully pinned hair was not desperation. It was dignity. It irritated him even more. The ceremony ended with polite applause instead of celebration. Photographers called for the newlyweds to stand closer together. Ethan took exactly one measured step back. The movement was subtle, yet every camera captured it. Reporters exchanged excited glances. Society would feast on those photographs by morning. Ethan turned toward Grace with an unreadable expression. He told her to listen carefully, speaking in the same calm tone he used during billion-dollar negotiations. He said, "You will have every comfort, every protection, and every respect my name provides. But don't mistake this marriage for affection. I will never love you." The ballroom entrance fell strangely quiet. It was as though the walls themselves had heard him. Grace lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat. Then she looked back with unexpected steadiness. She answered gently, saying, "That's all right. I never married you hoping to be loved." Something flickered across Ethan's face. It was too brief for anyone else to notice. Before he could decide why her answer unsettled him, a silver-haired elderly woman watched from the balcony above. She tightened her grip on the railing, her worried eyes fixed not on the groom, but on Grace. It was as if she alone knew the real reason this marriage had been arranged. She knew why the greatest danger to the Moretti family had never been standing outside its gates. The gates of the Moretti estate opened without a sound. The long, black limousine rolled through rows of towering oak trees. It stopped beneath the stone entrance of a mansion that looked more like a private museum than a family home. Grace stepped out slowly. Her small suitcase was already waiting beside the front door, because someone had unpacked the rest before she even arrived. Marble stairs stretched toward towering double doors. 2 lines of household staff stood there in perfect silence. No one smiled. No one welcomed her. They bowed politely to Ethan, then watched Grace with carefully hidden curiosity. Ethan removed his gloves and handed them to his chief steward without looking back. He said Mrs. Moretti will have everything she needs, and told him to make certain she is treated with respect. His words sounded generous, but his feet never stopped moving. Within seconds, he disappeared into the west wing. He left Grace standing alone beneath a ceiling, painted with scenes of old Italian victories. The steward offered a professional smile and told her that her room had been prepared. Grace followed quietly through endless hallways, lined with portraits of stern faces bearing the Moretti name. Every painting seemed to measure whether she belonged there. A pair of young maids whispered just loudly enough for her to hear. They said she doesn't look like a mafia queen, and maybe the boss lost a bet. Grace continued walking without slowing down. She had spent too many years hearing worse. Her bedroom overlooked a peaceful rose garden, but instead of admiring the view, she carefully folded her wedding dress into its garment bag. She changed into a simple cream sweater and a dark skirt. She noticed fresh flowers already arranged beside the window. They were white roses, the same flowers from the ceremony. She gently placed them in water before leaving the room to explore the unfamiliar mansion. The estate felt strangely empty, despite the number of employees moving through its halls. Everyone worked efficiently, speaking in low voices as though the house itself demanded quiet. As Grace passed the library, she heard the faint sound of a piano. Curious, she followed the music until it suddenly stopped. An elderly woman sat alone beside the grand piano. One hand rested against her chest, while the other struggled to reach a glass of water that had fallen just beyond her fingertips. Grace hurried across the room without hesitation. She softly asked the woman not to move. She knelt, retrieved the glass, poured fresh water, and supported the woman's trembling hand until she could drink comfortably. Grace gently asked if she felt better. The woman nodded with tired eyes and managed a grateful smile. She whispered that most people call for someone else, but Grace came herself. Grace smiled gently and said sometimes help shouldn't have to wait. The elderly woman studied her face for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and revealed a tiny silver music box. It was no larger than the palm of her hand. She said quietly that it belonged to her daughter, and she hadn't opened it in years. Grace accepted it carefully and wound the delicate key. A familiar lullaby floated through the room. It was soft enough to calm even the restless silence surrounding the estate. The woman's eyes filled with tears, but they were peaceful tears. At that exact moment, Ethan stopped outside the library doorway after finishing an unexpected business call. He had intended to continue upstairs, yet the melody held him in place. Through the half-open door, he saw something impossible. His grandmother had refused music, conversation, and nearly every visitor since losing her daughter years earlier. But now she was smiling. It was a genuine smile. Grace never noticed him watching. She remained seated beside the older woman, listening quietly as if there were nowhere else in the world she needed to be. Ethan frowned. No physician had managed this. No therapist had managed this. Yet somehow, the woman everyone dismissed before breakfast had accomplished it within an hour of entering his home. Before he could step inside, his chief of security approached quickly and lowered his voice. He said, "Sir, there is something you should see. We finished the background review on Mrs. Moretti. The report doesn't match the story your uncle gave you." Ethan accepted the thick black folder from his chief of security without saying a word. They stepped into his private study. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens, and the morning sun painted long shadows across the polished oak floor. The report contained only a few pages, yet every sentence chipped away at the version of Grace Harper his uncle had carefully presented. There was no record of scandal. There were no hidden debts, no reckless spending, and no desperate relatives chasing money. Instead, there were academic awards, volunteer work at community literacy programs, and financial certifications completed with honors. There were several recommendations from respected professors whose names Ethan recognized immediately. He slowly turned another page. A handwritten note from one professor caught his attention. It said Grace Harper possesses one of the sharpest analytical minds encountered in 30 years. She repeatedly declined prestigious positions because of family obligations. Ethan looked up and asked why none of this was mentioned. The security chief answered carefully. He said it was because someone wanted you to believe she had nothing to offer except obedience. Ethan closed the folder without commenting, but the quiet certainty in his eyes had changed. Later that afternoon, the executive board gathered inside the estate conference room for a quarterly investment review. The atmosphere was tense. Executives debated whether to acquire a struggling logistics company before an overseas competitor could act. Charts filled the enormous display while experienced analysts argued over projected losses and uncertain shipping routes. Ethan listened in silence. He allowed every opinion to settle before making his decision. Then the conference room door opened quietly. Grace stepped inside, carrying a silver tray with coffee prepared for the meeting. She apologized softly for the interruption and began placing each cup before the guests. No one paid much attention until one executive pointed toward the financial projection displayed on the screen. He stated that the acquisition is too risky. Grace glanced at the numbers for only a second before continuing to pour coffee. Then she hesitated and softly said, "Excuse me." Every face turned toward her. She immediately lowered her eyes and apologized, saying she shouldn't interrupt. Ethan folded his hands and said, "You already did. Finish what you were about to say." Grace looked uncomfortable, but the numbers continued pulling at her attention. She pointed out that the forecast assumes the Western ports will recover within 6 months. One executive nodded impatiently and said, "Correct." Grace shook her head almost apologetically. She said the insurance filings from last quarter suggest infrastructure repairs alone will take at least 9 months. If that estimate is wrong, your projected profit disappears during the second quarter. Silence settled over the room. Another executive quickly searched the report on his tablet before his eyebrows lifted. He said, "She is right." A second analyst opened government transportation updates. He confirmed the revised construction schedule was released yesterday morning. Ethan watched Grace instead of the screens. She didn't look proud. She looked embarrassed that everyone was staring at her. He asked her how she knew. Grace smiled faintly. She said she reads transportation journals with breakfast because shipping delays affect almost everything people buy. One by one, the executives quietly adjusted their calculations until the room reached the same conclusion. The acquisition would have cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan slowly stood, signaling the meeting was over. Every executive left with respectful nods toward him, but several looked back at Grace with completely different expressions than before. She began collecting the untouched coffee cups, clearly hoping the strange moment would be forgotten. Ethan walked toward her and lifted one report lying on the conference table. He pointed out that she never mentioned her financial background. Grace continued stacking saucers and simply replied that no one ever asked. Before Ethan could respond, his phone vibrated. His security chief spoke only one sentence after the call connected. He said, "Sir, we found evidence someone has been paying people for years to erase every achievement Mrs. Moretti ever accomplished, and the payments lead directly to your uncle's private foundation." That evening, rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the Moretti estate. Ethan stood alone in his study, reading every page his security team had recovered. School records had vanished from public databases. Internship offers had been quietly withdrawn. Scholarship recommendations had disappeared before reaching university boards. Every path that could have changed Grace Harper's future had somehow closed at exactly the right moment. None of it looked accidental anymore. A single name appeared again and again inside the investigation. Victor Moretti, his uncle. Ethan closed the file slowly, his jaw tightened without a word. Across the estate, Grace sat beside his grandmother in the library. She carefully wound the little silver music box once more. The familiar melody filled the room as the older woman smiled with peaceful eyes. She softly told Grace that she reminded her of someone. Grace looked up and asked who. The grandmother said her daughter. She always believed kindness could survive in places where love had disappeared. Grace lowered her eyes with a gentle smile. She said kindness is easier to keep than anger. The older woman reached across the table and squeezed her hand. She told Grace to promise her something. Never let this family convince you that you are less than you are. Grace nodded politely, although the words carried a weight she didn't fully understand. The following morning, Ethan found Grace alone in the estate greenhouse. She was trimming wilted flowers with careful hands. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, surrounding her with warm light instead of the harsh judgment he had grown used to seeing around her. For several seconds, he simply watched. She hummed quietly while rescuing a struggling white rose from an overcrowded planter. She moved it into fresh soil with remarkable patience. Ethan asked if she knew how to care for roses. Grace looked surprised to see him. She said her mother loved gardens. She gently pressed the soil into place, adding that her mother used to say flowers bloom better when they are given room instead of pressure. Ethan stepped closer. He noted that her file said almost nothing about her mother. Grace's smile faded. She brushed the dirt from her fingertips before answering. She said it was because her mother died when she was young. Ethan waited. Grace rarely volunteered anything about herself. Yet today, something inside her seemed tired of hiding. She said after her mother passed away, her uncle became her legal guardian. He always told her that attention brought danger. Her fingers touched the thick frames of her glasses. She said he insisted she wear these even after her eyesight improved. Ethan looked at the lenses more carefully. They appeared unusually thick. He asked if she still needed them. Grace hesitated before quietly removing them. For the first time, Ethan saw her face without the heavy frames hiding it. Nothing dramatic had changed, except the way her eyes caught the morning light. They were clear, intelligent, and quietly expressive. Grace looked almost uncomfortable beneath his silence. She admitted that her uncle also chose her clothes. He told her that plain girls are left alone, and beautiful women attract problems. Ethan glanced toward the loose sweater she always wore, despite the warm weather. He asked if she believed him. Grace gave a small, almost heartbreaking laugh. She said when someone repeats the same thing for years, eventually it starts sounding like the truth. Ethan said nothing. Instead, he noticed faint marks where the oversized glasses had rested against her face for years. They were unnecessary reminders of a life carefully designed to hide her. For the first time since their wedding, anger rose inside him without being directed at her. It was calm, controlled, and far more dangerous because it remained invisible. Before either of them could speak again, his security chief hurried into the greenhouse carrying another sealed envelope. He quietly said, "Sir, we found the final piece. Your grandfather left a confidential letter explaining exactly why he insisted that you marry Grace. And according to the family attorney, your uncle has spent years making sure no one would ever read it." The envelope rested on Ethan's desk long after everyone else had left the room. It was sealed with the faded wax emblem of the original Moretti family, untouched for years. His grandfather's handwriting stretched neatly across the front, bearing only his name. Ethan broke the seal with unusual care and unfolded the letter. Every line had been written by a man who already knew his time was running short. The first paragraph spoke of family, legacy, and responsibility. But the final pages changed everything. Grace Harper hadn't been chosen because she was weak. She had been chosen because she was the only person his grandfather believed could keep the Moretti family from destroying itself. The old man described meeting Grace years earlier during a charity event. He watched her quietly help strangers without expecting recognition. He praised her honesty, her intelligence, and her ability to remain kind in circumstances that would have made most people bitter. One sentence refused to leave Ethan's mind. His grandfather wrote that power without compassion eventually becomes its own prison. If our family is ever to deserve its future, it will need someone who remembers the value of ordinary people. That someone is Grace Harper. Ethan slowly folded the letter. For the first time in years, he realized his grandfather had trusted someone more than any blood relative. Outside the study, orders spread across the estate with remarkable speed. Ethan never raised his voice. He simply issued calm instructions. Every financial record connected to Victor Moretti was to be reviewed. Every archived family document was to be recovered. Every former employee dismissed from Victor's foundation would be located and interviewed. Within hours, investigators, attorneys, and accountants quietly began working across multiple cities. No one questioned the decision. When Ethan moved, an entire organization moved with him. Meanwhile, Grace spent the afternoon helping Ethan's grandmother organize forgotten family photographs inside the old music room. Dust covered dozens of albums that no one had opened in years. As she carefully cleaned each frame, she noticed a familiar face in one faded picture. A much younger version of Ethan's grandfather stood smiling beside a little girl with bright eyes and braided hair. Grace froze and asked who she was. The older woman adjusted her glasses before smiling sadly. She said, "That little girl is you." Grace looked again, unable to believe it. She said, "That can't be possible." The grandmother explained that Grace had visited there with her mother many years ago. Her husband had adored both of them. But after Grace's mother passed away, everything changed. Victor slowly separated the family from anyone her husband trusted. Grace stared at the photograph while forgotten memories surfaced in scattered pieces. She remembered the gardens, the roses, the same silver music box, and a warm voice, promising she would always have a place there. She had buried those memories so deeply that they almost felt like someone else's life. Before she could gather her thoughts, Ethan entered the room carrying the framed photograph. Their eyes met in complete silence. He gently placed the picture on the piano between them. He quietly said, "You have been here before." Grace nodded almost imperceptibly and said, "I think I had forgotten." Ethan looked at her differently now. The distance he had carefully maintained since the wedding no longer felt justified. He said her name, choosing each word with unusual care. He told her there are things about her past that were deliberately hidden from her, and he intended to uncover every one of them. Before she could answer, the estate's chief attorney rushed into the room, holding another newly recovered file. His usually composed expression had vanished. He struggled to steady his voice as he addressed Ethan. He said they had located the original guardianship documents. According to the records, Victor Harper was never supposed to become Grace's legal guardian in the first place. Someone had altered the court filing 20 years ago. The revelation about the forged guardianship documents changed the atmosphere inside the Moretti estate without anyone raising their voice. Ethan spent the following morning in the private archives. He was surrounded by attorneys, investigators, and historians who quietly assembled pieces of Grace's forgotten past. Every recovered document pointed in the same direction. 20 years earlier, after Grace's mother passed away, the court had approved a different guardian. It was a close friend of her mother who had been financially stable and eager to raise her. That approval vanished less than 48 hours later. It was replaced by Victor Moretti's name through a revised filing that no one could explain. Ethan rested both hands on the conference table as silence settled over the room. He calmly ordered them to recover every original record. He wanted every retired clerk who handled the case to be interviewed, demanding facts instead of assumptions. No one questioned him. Within minutes, phones rang across several states. Secure files were requested, and forgotten witnesses began receiving respectful invitations instead of demands. Grace knew nothing about the investigation. She spent her afternoon in the estate kitchen helping prepare lunch after discovering that one of the senior chefs had injured his wrist. She tied on a simple apron and worked beside the staff without introducing herself as the lady of the house. She chopped vegetables, tasted soup, and quietly thanked everyone who handed her an ingredient. The employees who had whispered about her only days earlier gradually stopped watching her with suspicion. One young housekeeper accidentally dropped an expensive serving plate. The sharp sound echoed through the kitchen. The frightened woman immediately apologized, expecting criticism. Grace simply knelt beside her before anyone else could react. She gently asked if the young woman was hurt. The young woman blinked in surprise and stammered that she was worried about the plate. Grace smiled as she carefully gathered the broken pieces. She said, "Plates can be replaced, but people can't." Several employees exchanged silent glances. Word spread through the estate before dinner that the new Mrs. Moretti had comforted a housekeeper instead of blaming her. Ethan heard the story from the chief steward while reviewing financial reports. He said nothing, but a faint expression of reflection crossed his face. Later that evening, he found Grace sitting alone in the rose garden. She was reading an old gardening book beneath strings of soft lights. He noticed she had removed the oversized glasses again. She replaced them with a much lighter pair, recommended by the family physician earlier that afternoon. She looked up when she sensed someone nearby. With a quiet smile, she said the roses are healthier than they appeared. They were only planted too close together. Ethan looked across the garden. The flowers stood taller than they had just days before. He told her she seemed to improve everything she touched. Grace laughed softly and said not everything. For the first time since their wedding, Ethan smiled without realizing it. It was brief, almost hidden, but genuine. Grace noticed it and looked away before he could see the warmth that appeared in her own eyes. Neither of them spoke for several moments. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. As Grace stood to return inside, she stumbled slightly on the stone pathway after catching the edge of her shoe. Ethan instinctively reached forward and steadied her before she lost her balance. Their hands remained together for only a heartbeat, yet neither pulled away immediately. Grace quietly thanked him. Something inside Ethan shifted in a way no business victory had ever accomplished. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated. He stepped aside to answer. His lead investigator spoke in a controlled voice. He said, "Sir, we located the woman who was supposed to become Grace's legal guardian 20 years ago. She is alive. She has kept every letter she wrote asking for custody. And she says there is one final truth that Grace has never been told about the day her mother died." 3 days later, the grand ballroom of the Moretti Foundation welcomed senators, business leaders, charity patrons, and nearly every influential family in New York for the annual Legacy Gala. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble, while a string quartet filled the room with elegant music. At first glance, it appeared to be another celebration of wealth and influence. Ethan knew better. Victor Moretti had organized the evening with one purpose. He intended to remind everyone exactly where Grace belonged. Grace entered quietly beside Ethan. She wore a simple ivory evening gown, chosen by Ethan's grandmother. There were no extravagant diamonds, no dramatic entrance, and no attempt to compete with the glitter surrounding her. She carried herself with calm dignity. She greeted each guest with a warm smile that slowly softened even the coldest expressions. Across the ballroom, Victor watched silently before raising a crystal glass. He warmly announced to the room that tonight they celebrate tradition. His words earned polite applause. Then his smile shifted almost imperceptibly. He said they also celebrate those fortunate enough to receive opportunities beyond what anyone expected. Several guests exchanged knowing glances. The room understood exactly who he meant. Victor continued speaking with practiced charm. He mentioned sacrifice, charity, and generosity without ever saying Grace's name. Yet every carefully chosen sentence painted her as someone rescued through pity rather than respected through merit. Grace stood perfectly still. She had heard versions of the same story for years. Before Ethan could respond, she lightly touched his sleeve beneath the table. Her gentle expression asked him to wait. She refused to let humiliation define another chapter of her life. Victor finally invited several guests to share stories about family success. One executive unexpectedly stood up. He respectfully addressed Mrs. Moretti, saying that before the night ended, he wanted to thank her. Grace looked surprised and asked why. He explained that her observation during last week's investment review saved their company from a disastrous acquisition. They verified every number, and her analysis was exactly right. Murmurs spread across the ballroom. Another guest smiled and said his wife still talks about how kindly Grace treated the staff during her first week at the estate. A third guest nodded, adding that Ethan's grandmother has looked happier these past few days than she has in years. Victor's confident smile weakened almost invisibly. Ethan remained silent, watching the room change direction without lifting a finger. Grace had earned every compliment herself. Then Victor made one final attempt. He smoothly stated that intelligence is admirable, but family reputation can't simply be learned overnight. Ethan slowly placed his glass on the table. The quiet sound echoed farther than any raised voice could have. Every conversation stopped. He stood calmly beside Grace and looked around the ballroom before speaking. He said, "You are absolutely correct, Uncle." Victor smiled again, believing he had won. Ethan continued, stating that reputation can't be borrowed. It is built by character. He turned toward Grace. He told the room that since marrying Grace, he had watched her earn the respect of his grandmother, his household, his advisors, and his executives without ever asking for recognition. She accomplished in 1 week what many people fail to achieve in an entire lifetime. The room remained completely silent. Ethan's voice never rose above a calm conversation. He said, "Anyone who insults my wife insults my judgment. Anyone who questions her integrity questions mine. From this day forward, Grace Moretti speaks with my full confidence, and that confidence is not negotiable." The applause began with one elderly board member, then another, until nearly the entire ballroom stood in support. Grace looked at Ethan in stunned silence. Her eyes shimmered with emotion she had never expected to feel. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to stand beside her instead of allowing her to stand alone. Victor quietly lowered his glass. But before leaving the stage, he slipped a sealed envelope into the hands of the family attorney with a faint smile. Minutes later, the attorney hurried toward Ethan. His expression was unusually pale. He whispered that his uncle had just submitted what he claimed was his grandfather's final legal amendment. If this document was authentic, everything the family owned might no longer belong to Ethan. The ballroom remained silent as the family attorney carefully unfolded the newly delivered amendment. Every influential guest waited for the first word. Ethan stood beside Grace without moving. His expression was calm enough to make the room even more uneasy. The attorney adjusted his glasses and studied every signature, every seal, and every page before looking toward Ethan. He announced that the document appeared to transfer controlling authority of the Moretti family trust under very specific conditions. Victor smiled with quiet confidence. He claimed his father believed leadership required maturity. Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. But Grace noticed something unusual. The paper looked new. It looked too new. She had spent years organizing legal files during volunteer work at a community legal clinic, and old documents never folded so perfectly. She leaned slightly toward Ethan and whispered, asking if she could see it. Without hesitation, he accepted the request and handed her the amendment in front of everyone. Victor laughed softly. He asked if Ethan expected her to understand legal history. Ethan answered before Grace could speak, stating simply that he trusts his wife. Grace carefully examined the pages. Her fingertips paused over the final sheet. She closed her eyes for a brief moment before reopening them. She quietly stated that the signature is genuine. Victor's smile widened. He said, "Exactly." Grace continued without looking at him. "But the paper is not." The room became perfectly still. She gently turned the last page toward the attorney. She explained that this watermark was introduced by the manufacturer only 12 years ago. The grandfather supposedly signed this document more than 20 years ago. The signature might be authentic, but this page could not have existed when he supposedly signed it. The attorney immediately leaned forward with visible surprise before calling another legal expert from the audience. Within minutes, both specialists reached the same conclusion. The final page had been substituted long after the original document had been executed. Shock rippled across the ballroom. Victor's composed expression finally cracked. Before anyone could question him, his personal assistant hurried toward him, carrying a phone with trembling hands. Victor listened for only a few seconds before ending the call abruptly. Ethan noticed the sudden change and asked what happened. Victor forced a smile that no longer convinced anyone. He claimed it was a minor business issue. Ethan quietly nodded toward his chief investigator. Within moments, discreet messages spread through the security team. Nobody rushed. Nobody shouted. Doors quietly remained closed while every guest continued enjoying dinner. They were completely unaware that a careful investigation had already begun throughout the building. Grace looked toward Ethan, and said you already knew something like this might happen. He met her eyes and said, "I hoped I was wrong." Just then, Ethan's investigator approached with remarkable composure. He said, "Sir, we have recovered the original amendment from the private archives beneath your uncle's foundation. It completely contradicts the version presented tonight." Victor took one involuntary step backward. His confidence had disappeared. Ethan didn't celebrate. He simply looked at his uncle with deep disappointment. He said, "You spent years hiding the truth from your own family." Before Victor could answer, another member of Ethan's security team entered the ballroom. He was carrying a small wooden box wrapped in protective cloth. He said they also found this locked inside the archive vault. Ethan carefully opened the box. Resting inside was an old cassette recorder and a handwritten note from his grandfather. The note read, "If Grace ever learns who she truly is, let her hear my voice before anyone else's." Grace stared at the recorder with trembling hands. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the music surrounding them. The attorney looked at Ethan with visible emotion and confirmed the recording was authentic. Ethan gently placed the recorder into Grace's hands. He told her whenever she was ready. Grace slowly pressed the play button. After years of silence, the warm, familiar voice of a man she barely remembered filled the ballroom. It carried words that would change both of their lives forever. The recording began with the gentle crackle of old magnetic tape before an elderly voice filled the silent ballroom with quiet warmth. He said, "If you are hearing this, my dear Grace, then life has finally returned something that should never have been taken from you." Grace closed her eyes as every guest remained perfectly still. The voice continued. "He said your mother once saved our family without asking for recognition. And after she was gone, I promised I would protect you. I failed that promise, but I never stopped believing you would find your way home." Tears slipped down Grace's face before she even realized she was crying. The voice continued. He said, "The greatest inheritance I can leave my grandson is not money, influence, or power. It is the chance to meet a woman whose heart reminds him that kindness is never weakness." When the recording ended, the silence felt heavier than any speech. Ethan looked toward Grace. For the first time since their wedding, he understood why his grandfather had trusted fate more than control. The family attorney carefully placed the authentic amendment and the recovered evidence on the table before the Board of Trustees. One by one, each document confirmed the same truth. Victor had manipulated records for years. He concealed original files and presented altered documents that could no longer withstand independent review. The trustees quietly voted to invalidate every fraudulent amendment and restore the original estate plan. No celebration followed. Justice arrived with calm certainty rather than triumph. Victor lowered his head. He realized the reputation he had spent decades building had collapsed under the weight of his own choices. He slowly removed his family signet ring and placed it on the table. He left the ballroom without another word. Grace watched him disappear, but there was no satisfaction in her expression. There was only quiet relief that the years of deception had finally ended. Several guests approached to congratulate her, yet she politely excused herself. She walked into the moonlit rose garden, where the evening breeze carried the fragrance of fresh blossoms through the estate. Ethan found her standing beside the same flower bed where she had transplanted the struggling white roses only days earlier. They now stood taller than ever. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer belonged to strangers. Ethan reached into his jacket and removed the simple wedding ring she had worn since the ceremony. He held it carefully in his palm before kneeling on one knee in front of her. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. Ethan spoke softly. He said, "The day we married, I believed I was honoring an obligation. I kept my distance because I thought love could never grow from duty. I was wrong." He looked directly into her eyes, his voice steady and sincere. He said, "The world told me I had married the wrong woman. Every day since then has proven that the only person who truly saw me was you. You changed my home without demanding authority. You earned respect without asking for it. You reminded me that real strength protects instead of controlling." He took a deep breath. "Grace, I cannot change the words I spoke on our wedding day, but I can spend the rest of my life proving they no longer define us." Will you let me become the husband you deserved from the very beginning?" Grace smiled through quiet tears before extending her hand. She whispered, "I never wanted a perfect husband. I only hoped for an honest one." Ethan gently slipped the ring back onto her finger. It was no longer a symbol of obligation, but a promise freely chosen by both of them. Behind them, his grandmother watched from the library window with peaceful eyes. The little silver music box played its familiar lullaby one final time. Months later, the Moretti estate became known not for whispered fear, but for its charitable foundation. It hosted scholarship programs and open gardens where families gathered every spring. Grace led each project with quiet grace. Ethan stood beside her instead of in front of her. Every visitor noticed the same simple truth. The most powerful man in the room was no longer the one who commanded the loudest silence. He was the one who never stopped choosing the woman everyone else had once failed to see.